They say context is everything, and sometimes they're right. Suppose for a moment you saw a headline that read, "Man pushes old woman to the ground." You probably think to yourself, that guy's a jerk, right? So imagine how surprised you'd be to find out later that same man was getting a medal from the mayor for that very same incident. So what's going on? Does the mayor not like the old woman? Well, it's possible. Or perhaps the reporter simply took the incident out of context. The only way to find out is to dive in and figure it out for yourself. After a little investigating, it doesn't take you long to find out that he actually shoved her out of the way of a speeding bus and saved her life. Historians often debate the context of various historical issues. That debate is probably no more intense than when it comes to various elements of our own Constitution. One such debate centers on the 3/5 clause of the Constitution. This is a very controversial subject in this country because it deals directly with the most sensitive and divisive issue America has ever experienced, the issue of slavery. As such, the 3/5 clause is often misunderstood. To clarify, the clause basically says that slaves are to be counted only as 3/5 of a human being. Because of this, some are quick to dismiss the entire document as racist to its core. Abolitionist and publicist William Lloyd Garrison called the Constitution a covenant with death and an agreement with hell when he burned a copy of the document in 1854. Is that fair? Or is the 3/5 clause being taken out of context, like our previous example? Let's take it a step further. Is the 3/5 clause of the U.S. Constitution evidence of a racist Constitution, or is it the first blow for civil rights in the United States? The only way to answer that question is to figure it out for ourselves. To begin with, let's not forget that the 3/5 clause came as a result of the 3/5 Compromise. In other words, it was a compromise reached between two opposing factions in attendance at the Constitutional Convention that set the value of people in bondage as 3/5 of a human being. So the first thing we need to do is understand those two factions. Which side wanted to count a slave as a full person, and under what circumstances? Which side was fighting against counting slaves at all, and why? It may or may not surprise you to learn that the two factions fighting over this issue were the pro-slavery forces mostly in the South, and the anti-slavery forces largely from the North. The big question is which side did not want a slave to be counted as a person at all. If you guessed the pro-slavery side, you're wrong. Believe it or not, the anti-slavery abolitionists, some of whom not only wanted to end slavery and free all slaves in the United States at the time, but also grant them citizenship and full rights under the Constitution, did not want to count those slaves as people in that same Constitution. Confused? Don't worry, we're going to clear it all up right now. The explanation lies in the same part of the Constitution that contains the 3/5 clause, or at least used to contain it. We'll get to that later. Article 1, Section 2. Let's quickly review. The United States Congress consists of two separate houses, the Senate and the House of Representatives. The number of senators in the Senate is fixed at 2 per state, regardless of the size of the state in either area or population. Currently, there are 100 senators in the Senate. 50 states, 2 senators each. Simple, right? As for the House, Article 1, Section 2 says, representatives and direct taxes shall be apportioned among the several states which may be included within this union according to their respective numbers. This means that a state's population determines the number of representatives that state will have in the House of Representatives. The larger the share of the total U.S. population that live in a given state, the larger the share of representatives that state will have in the House, period. Currently, the total number of members of the House of Representatives is 435. California is the most densely populated state in the Union, with over 37 million people, which earns it 53 seats in the House. Texas is second with over 25 million, and thus has 36 seats respectively. Texas used to have just 32 seats in the House, but it was determined in the 2010 census that Texas had grown enough in population since the 2000 census to have gained 4 seats from other states whose share of the total U.S. population had decreased during that same period. 7 states each have populations of less than 1 million people, and therefore each have only 1 representative in the House. The House of Representatives is a central pillar to the representative democracy the founders were trying to create. And that's where this issue between the pro-slavery and anti-slavery factions developed. The more seats a state holds in the House of Representatives, the more influence that state has over bills passed by the House. That fact was as true in 1787 as it is today, and both sides of the slavery debate knew it. Slaveholders in the South knew the numbers were against them, both in terms of population and money. The North was wealthier and had more people. The three largest cities in the new country were all in the North: New York, Boston, and Philadelphia. The South did have Baltimore, but Washington, D.C. hadn't even been thought of yet. Atlanta existed only as a Creek Indian village, and New Orleans was still owned by the French. Charleston and Richmond were as big as any city the South had at the time. But what they did have that most of the North did not were slaves, and they were determined to use their numbers to bolster their population and gain more seats in the House. With more seats, they would be better able to stop legislation by abolitionists to weaken the institution of slavery. In fact, they might also be able to pass bills through the House of Representatives that would strengthen slavery in the United States. Abolitionists were keenly aware of this and determined to prevent the spread of slavery in the new country, or at least maintain a balance of power. Anti-slavery delegates would have preferred to see an end to slavery altogether. Delaware delegate John Dickinson, for example, argued forcefully against slavery during the convention. However, it became increasingly clear that the institution was so deeply ingrained in Southern culture and so much a part of the economies of the slave states that there was no chance of that happening. On the other hand, more representation in the House by slave states could set the abolition movement back decades. If slave states had more power in the House of Representatives, they might be in a position to pass legislation that would make it more difficult in the future to eradicate slavery. Additionally, with apportionment on the line, slave states might feel compelled to import more slaves, if they were wholly counted, to further increase their representation. Two provisions were put in the Constitution that might lend a hand to the abolitionist cause. First was a clause that would not allow slave importation into the states after a period of 20 years, and the other tied federal taxation to population in the same way representation was linked. Remember, Article 1, Section 2 does read, "Representation and direct taxes shall be apportioned," and at the time there was no income tax. States paid taxes directly to the federal government. But that representation issue and how slaves should be counted still loomed large. Slave states wanted to count their slaves as human beings to increase their representation, but they didn't want to treat their slaves as human beings. So why didn't the anti-slavery crowd just stick to their guns? Why didn't they argue to the end that the blight of slavery is contrary to the principles of the Declaration of Independence and so has no place in this Constitution? Why didn't they just say, we're not going to have slavery in this new country, it's our way or the highway? Because had they done so, it would have been the highway. Remember, the Revolution had begun as very much a New England war. But it didn't take long for the Yankees to realize that if they were to stand any chance against the British, they were going to need the help of their Southern brethren. The Constitutional Convention was only 4 years since the end of the war, and united we stand, divided we fall was still a very accurate description. Gone was the British Empire, but in 1812, just 25 years after the convention, they were back on American soil. There were other empires we had to watch out for as well. The French were our allies, but we couldn't trust them. For that matter, what about the Spanish or the Dutch? Even the Russians were making noise across Asia and Eastern Europe all the way to North America. The point is, it was a very dangerous world, and if we didn't remain the United States of America, we might not remain states at all. So okay, what if this issue succeeded in splitting us apart, but we somehow managed to avoid reoccupation by some European power and stood as two separate American countries, North and South? Well, in that case, not only would the United States cease to exist, but so too would any chance of ending slavery, either at the time or in the future. Short of invasion, what power does one country ever have over another in terms of how the other treats its own population? That truth holds even today. The only possible solution that would preserve the Union and leave the anti-slavery forces in a position to eventually eliminate slavery in the United States was the same one that would preserve the status quo: compromise. Therefore, after much debate and haggling back and forth, they all finally agreed to set the value of a slave at 3/5 of a person. Finally, notice the wording of the clause. It does not mention any race. It simply says 3/5 of all other persons. This is deliberate. They did not want to make a distinction based on race. Keep in mind that there were free blacks living in the United States at the time, in the South as well as in the North. To define it by race would ignore this fact. States were free to set their own voting laws, and the 9th and 10th Amendments to the Constitution protected this right. Several states had provisions in their own Constitution protecting citizenship and voting rights for free blacks. These included Delaware and Maryland, both slave states that remained loyal to the Union in the Civil War. It was the Civil War and the subsequent ratification of the 14th Amendment in 1865 that would once and for all eliminate the 3/5 clause of Article 1, Section 2. But the debate continues concerning the purpose and morality of the clause. Perhaps the best place to look to shed some light on the thinking of the time is in the words of James Madison himself, one of the architects of the Constitution. The Federalist Papers were a series of opinion pieces published at the time in newspapers around the country that defended the Constitution and argued in favor of its ratification. Madison, arguing the case for the 3/5 clause, wrote this in Federalist number 54.
It is the character bestowed on them by the laws under which they live, and it will not be denied that these are the proper criterion, because it is only under the pretext that the laws have transformed the Negroes into subjects of property that a place has disputed them in the computation of numbers. And it is admitted that if the laws were to restore the rights which have been taken away, the Negroes could no longer be refused an equal share of representation with the other inhabitants.